Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and remove all of your little covers and then your 19mm lug nuts. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a nice clear view of our brakes. We're just going to go ahead and spray down the rotor with some penetrant to help relieve it from the wheel bearing. Now we can let that sit and let's move along to the caliper itself. Now for the caliper, what we need to do is we need to push in the piston. The piston is located inside of here, and it basically goes inside of this area. To do this, I'm just going to use a small pry bar. We'll carefully get in between the caliper and the rotor itself and gently start pulling it in this direction. That'll push in the piston. When you do this, it's a good idea to do it slowly. There we are. Now we can move along to our two 14mm headed caliper slider bolts. Let's remove the pair. Now we can remove the caliper from the vehicle. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to this area along here. This is your caliper boot. You want to make sure you don't see any fluid coming out of here, and you also want to make sure you don't see any tears. Either way, if you saw fluid or a tear, you're going to have to go ahead and replace the caliper. Assuming it looks good, let's continue on by hanging it so it's putting no pressure on our rubber flex hose. Now it's going to be time to remove the pads from the caliper bracket. We'll continue with our small pry bar and carefully pry these out. Typically, I like to give them a good inspection just to see if it looks like they're wearing oddly. At this point, we can continue on to our two 15mm headed bolts that hold the caliper bracket to the knuckle. I'm going to leave this one in here a couple threads, fully remove the second. Remove your bracket. We'll give this a quick inspection. We're going to have a closer look in a minute. Go ahead and set this aside. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and get the rotor off of here. If yours is rusted like ours is, you're going to have to use a hammer. But if you're going to be reusing the rotor, make sure you don't hit on the braking surface. I'm going to be replacing my brakes anyway. Let's use a hammer, and we're going to give this a loving bonk to break it free. Remove your rotor. Now that we have the brakes off of there, let's go ahead and remove this 30mm axle nut. Behind there, there's going to be a washer. Go ahead and remove that as well. Just use a magnet to get this off of here. Now let's continue on with a hammer and a punch. We're going to come right in the center here and break this free. Now we're going to have to access the back side of the knuckle. You're going to find 3 15mm headed bolts. 2 are easily accessed from the front of the knuckle, and then the third one is located on the other side of the knuckle. Let's go ahead and remove all 3. Now at this point, I always like to put the axle nut on a couple threads. Now we can continue on with our hammer. We're going to give this a couple loving bonks and try to drive it away from the knuckle. You can see it starting to separate. Now we're going to remove this shield. We'll give that a quick inspection. We'll deal with this in a second. And there it is, friends. With the wheel bearing out of the knuckle, let's continue on by cleaning up the knuckle. The main areas that you want to pay attention to while cleaning this are along this outer aspect, right here. You also want to make sure you get inside of this inner circle. As you can tell, there's generally going to be a lot of corrosion in this area. Any of that could create a little bit of a buildup and make it so your wheel bearing doesn't sit properly. Go ahead and clean it up. Now once you have the knuckle cleaned up, continue on with your brush and clean the splines for the axle. Let's give it a rinse. Once everything's nice and clean, continue on with a little bit of copper never sees. We want to make sure we get the entire mating surface along here, and especially on the inside right there. Once you have all that done, continue on with the splines of the axle. The next thing that we're going to want to do is clean up both sides of this bracket. clean your bolts, put on some red thread locker. Now we can take our tin and our brand new wheel bearing and we'll start putting it in place. Now if you were to look at this tin, you can tell that the holes are a little oblonged. So are the holes on the knuckle itself. And so are the holes on the back of the bearing. Go ahead and line up all three of the holes on all the pieces. Now we can start in all three of our mounting bolts. Now let's go ahead and bottom each of these out, and then when we torque them, we'll torque them to 85 foot-pounds. At this point, I always use some red thread locker on the axle shaft here. Let's put on our washer. Time for the axle nut. Now for this, you just want to go ahead and bottom this out by hand. After that, we'll get this a little closer to the ground and we'll torque it to manufacturer specification. Now I'm going to continue on by torquing this to 155 foot-pounds. I went ahead and I put the bar here to hold this in place while I continue. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and coat the bearing surface with some copper never sees. Now the next thing that you would want to do is go ahead and clean up the inside of the brake rotor, right where that hub's going to sit. As you can tell, our brake rotor is in very poor condition. I'm going to be replacing it anyways. But either way, just go ahead and sand down this area so it's smooth and flat. Let's clean down our rotor braking surface. Go ahead and turn it over, do the exact same thing. Now we can place this on our wheel bearing. It's a good idea to use a lug nut to hold it in place. Clean your mounting bolts for the caliper bracket and apply a thin amount of red thread locker. After that, we can go ahead and get the bracket into position. Let's slide it right on over the rotor and line up the holes with the knuckle. We'll start in both of these mounting bolts, snug them up, and then we'll torque each of them to 85 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to dealing with the brake pads. Now for the brake pads, you want to make sure that it does have the wear indicator on it. Typically the wear indicator is going to be on the inboard pad on the bottom. So all you want to do is just take a wear indicator and you're going to put it right into the groove. Now we can take that pad and we're going to put it in position into the caliper bracket. Now you're just going to want to make sure that it can move around easily inside here. If you had to force it in or even use a hammer, typically that means that you did not clean up the caliper bracket well enough. Go ahead and put on the outboard pad. The outboard pad will not have a wear indicator. Next, it's going to be time to deal with the caliper itself. Typically, I like to use a nice brass brush, and I'm just going to go ahead and clean this down. I want to make sure that there isn't any rust buildup on this that might cause a braking issue. When you're doing this, you also want to make sure you get the back side of each of these ears. Now we'll continue on with a little bit more high temperature caliper lubricant. The areas that we're going to use this is right along the metallic aspect of the piston here, right in the center. Once you have that well coated, we're going to move along to the backside of each of these ears. All this is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can take the caliper and we're going to put it right on over the brake pads. You also want to make sure that it slides over the pins properly. Now we can put in our caliper slider bolts. Once they're in, go ahead and bottom them out and then torque each of them to 25 foot-pounds. 14 millimeter to snug these. Now we can get this lug nut off of here. Now we'll put the wheel back on. Start on all 4 of our 19 millimeter lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you had a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. Pay attention to this area on the hubcap. That's the area where your valve stem needs to go. We'll get this lined up, and now we can go ahead and tighten up all of our lug covers. Okay friends, we got our wheel bearing installed. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to hop inside the passenger compartment and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thank you for watching.